I'd been hiding from my mob family for 3 years when a customer told me, "Your cousin says hi." I kept scanning his items like nothing had happened, like my whole body hadn't just gone numb. The customer was already walking away, just a guy in a baseball cap buying a soda. But those words changed everything. Nobody here knew I had a cousin. Here I was Stella, and Stella didn't have family. But before that, I was Isabella Torino, who had dozens of cousins. Cousins who were out for blood ever since I testified against them. I forced myself to keep working, bagging groceries for the next customer, an elderly woman buying cat food. But my mind was racing through escape routes and contingency plans I'd made 3 years ago. They'd found me in this tiny Nebraska town where I'd been stupid enough to think I was safe. My manager Greg walked by and asked if I was feeling okay because apparently I'd been standing there holding a can of soup for 30 seconds without moving. I mumbled something about not enough sleep and continued scanning, but every beep of the register sounded like a countdown to something terrible. 4 more hours left on my shift and I couldn't leave early without raising questions I didn't want to answer. Every customer who came through my line could be watching me, reporting back to the family about my blonde hair and name tag that said Stella. The man buying a single bottle of water who paid with 100. The woman who kept staring while I counted her change. Were they real customers or scouts sent to confirm it was really me? I thought about running right then, just walking out the door and driving until I hit Canada. But that's what stupid people did, and stupid people ended up in car trunks. The family was patient and methodical, and they'd probably been watching me for weeks before making contact, learning my routines and relationships. They knew about David, the paramedic I'd been dating for 6 months. They knew about my Tuesday night book club and my Saturday morning runs. My hands shook as I handled money and I kept dropping things. Coins scattering across the floor, a jar of sauce shattering in aisle 3. Greg asked if I needed to go home sick, but I said no, because running would make it worse. They knew where I worked now, probably knew where I lived, and panicking would only make me easier to catch. A man came through my line buying zip ties, plastic sheeting, and bleach. And normally that combination would just be someone doing home repairs, but today it made my stomach turn. He smiled at me while I rang him up and said something about the weather, but all I could think about was my cousin Polly, who'd handled problems for the family until he got caught with a body in his trunk. During my break, I hid in the bathroom and tried to think, but my mind kept circling back to what happened to Aunt Marie when she tried to leave the family. They brought her back in a wheelchair, and she never said what they did to her, just sat at family dinners staring at nothing with clouded eyes. That was 20 years ago, and she still couldn't walk, still couldn't speak above a whisper. I splashed cold water on my face and stared at myself in the mirror, at this stranger with badly bleached hair and dark roots showing through. 3 years I'd been Stella. 3 years of lying to everyone about where I came from and why I had no family photos. 3 years of building something normal and quiet and safe, and it was all crumbling because I'd been stupid enough to use my mother's birthday when I created my new identity. 3 more hours of scanning and bagging while pretending my life wasn't collapsing. A customer complained I'd double-charged them, and I had to call Greg over to void the transaction, while my face burned with embarrassment and fear. Every minute that passed without something happening made it worse because I knew they were out there, waiting, enjoying my terror. The family liked the waiting almost as much as the violence because fear was a tool they'd perfected over generations. When my shift finally ended, I changed out of my uniform with shaking hands and went to my car, checking the back seat before getting in. No one followed me home, but there was a business card under my windshield wiper that just said, Torino Construction, with the Chicago address I recognized as one of the family's legitimate fronts. My apartment building looked normal, but my heart was hammering as I climbed the stairs. The hallway was empty and my door was locked just like I'd left it. But when I walked inside, my cousin Tony was sitting on my couch reading one of my magazines like he belonged there. He looked up and smiled, older and grayer than 3 years ago, but still wearing one of those expensive suits he loved. He said, "Isabella, you look good as a blonde." I grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter and said, "Get out." He laughed and stood up, straightening his tie. He said, "The family invested $2 million in legal fees because of your testimony. Uncle Sal's doing 25 to life, Cousin Ricky got 15 years, and the feds seized 3 restaurants. You cost us a lot." I said, "I don't have any money." He said, "You think I care? Don't pretend like you don't know how to get your hands dirty when you have to. $2 million plus interest. Or everyone in your nice little life finds out who you really are, right before they start having accidents." Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I wanted to throw the knife at him, but my arm wouldn't move, frozen while my brain screamed at me to do something. Tony walked toward me slowly with his hands up like he was calming a scared animal, and I backed against the kitchen counter until there was nowhere left to go. He stopped a few feet away and his smile never changed, just patient and calm like he had all the time in the world. He told me the family had been watching for 6 weeks, that they knew about David and his Tuesday paramedic shifts, about my book club meetings at the library, about my Saturday morning runs through the park. They knew I bought the same coffee every morning at the shop on 5th Street, and that I always worked the early shift on Thursdays. His voice stayed friendly and casual like we were catching up at a family dinner instead of him threatening everyone I cared about. He explained that $2 million wasn't negotiable, but I had options for how to pay it back, and the family was willing to be reasonable about the timeline if I cooperated and stayed put. He said running would just make things harder for me and anyone who tried to help me disappear. The knife felt heavy in my hand and completely useless because what was I going to do? Stab my cousin in my apartment and explain that to the police. Tony reached past me to grab an apple from the bowl on my counter, taking a bite while he waited for me to say something. I asked how long I had, and he said that depended on how smart I was about this, that the family appreciated people who understood business. He finished the apple and tossed the core in my trash like he lived here, then straightened his tie again and headed for the door. He turned back and reminded me that everyone I'd built a life with here was real to me, but just leverage to the family and accidents happen to people all the time. Then he walked out through my front door like a normal visitor leaving after a normal conversation. I stood there holding the knife for maybe 2 full minutes after he left, my legs shaking so bad I thought I might fall. Then I ran to the door and locked it, checking the deadbolt 3 times before wedging a chair under the handle. I went to every window in the apartment and made sure they were locked, pulling the curtains closed even though it was still light outside. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I pulled out my phone and searched for how to find hidden cameras, reading through dozens of articles that just made me more scared. Every article said to look for tiny holes, check smoke detectors, examine outlets and light fixtures, scan for wireless signals. I spent the next 2 hours taking apart every smoke detector in my apartment and checking behind every picture frame on the walls. I unscrewed outlet covers and looked inside, examined the vents, checked under furniture and inside lamps. I found nothing, but that didn't mean nothing was there, just that I wasn't smart enough to find what they'd hidden. The not knowing felt worse than finding something because at least then I'd understand what they could see. I went to the bathroom and pried up the baseboard behind the toilet where I'd hidden my emergency cash 3 years ago. The plastic bag was still there with $3,000 in 20s and 50s. Money I'd been saving from every paycheck for exactly this kind of situation. I counted it twice to make sure it was all there, then started packing a go bag with clothes, my fake ID documents, toiletries, and the cash. The practical actions helped me breathe slower and think more clearly instead of just panicking. I pulled out my phone and typed a text to David explaining everything, telling him who I really was and why I had to leave. Then I read it back and realized sending it would just put him in danger, make him a loose end the family might need to tie up. I deleted the message word by word until my phone was blank again. The go bag went in my closet behind my winter coats where I could grab it fast if I needed to run. I thought about calling 911, but what would I even say to them? My cousin visited me and made some vague comments about accidents. He didn't hit me or pull a weapon, didn't make specific threats they could arrest him for. Without proof of immediate danger or actual crimes happening right now, calling the police might just speed up the family's timeline. They'd know I was trying to get help, and that would make them act faster before I could build any kind of case. I took the knife from the kitchen and put it under my pillow, then changed into sweatpants and a t-shirt but kept my shoes right next to the bed. I lay there in my clothes staring at the ceiling and listening to every sound in the hallway, my heart jumping every time someone walked past my door. Around midnight, I finally dozed off but jerked awake at 2 in the morning when someone slammed a car door outside. I didn't really sleep after that, just lay there watching the numbers on my clock change and trying to figure out what to do. At work the next morning, I scanned items on autopilot while my eyes tracked every single customer who came through my line. An older man buying bread and milk, a woman with 2 kids getting cereal and juice boxes, a teenager buying energy drinks and chips. Any of them could be watching me and reporting back to the family about whether I looked scared enough. I shortchanged a customer by $5 and didn't notice until they pointed it out, then did it again 20 minutes later to someone else. Greg came over during a slow period and asked if I was feeling okay because I seemed really out of it. I told him I hadn't been sleeping well and he said I needed to be more careful with the register because customers were complaining. A man came through my line buying zip ties and a bottle of bleach, and my stomach turned over even though he was probably just doing normal home repairs. I kept thinking about my cousin Polly and the stories I'd heard growing up about how he handled family problems. During my lunch break, I sat in my car and stared at the business card Tony had left under my windshield wiper. The Torino Construction logo looked so normal and professional, like any other family business instead of a front for money laundering and worse. I took out my phone and photographed the card from multiple angles, getting clear shots of the address and phone number. It felt like taking back some tiny bit of control, like I was gathering evidence even though I had no idea what I'd do with it. I opened my phone's browser and searched for news articles about Uncle Sal's case from 3 years ago. The headlines came up immediately talking about the construction bid rigging scheme and how federal prosecutors had broken up a major organized crime operation. My testimony was mentioned in every article as the key evidence that made the case, the family member who'd turned on her own blood. Reading about it made my hands shake again because it reminded me exactly how much they hated me. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and when I opened it, the message just said, "TikTok." My heart started hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat and my hands got sweaty holding the phone. I stared at those 2 words for a full minute before I could make myself close the message and go back inside. The text meant they had my personal cell number now, not just my work address and apartment. They could reach me anytime they wanted to remind me the clock was running. I finished my shift smiling at customers and making small talk while my brain calculated how many days I had before the family lost patience. Every hour that passed felt like it was bringing me closer to something terrible. After work, I stopped at the drugstore and bought a small spiral notebook with cash, the kind students use for classes. Back in my car, I started writing down everything that had happened, starting with the customer who'd said your cousin says hi. I wrote the date and time as close as I could remember, then described exactly what he looked like and what he'd said. Then the business card under my windshield. Then Tony in my apartment with every detail I could remember about what he'd said and how he'd acted. Then the text message with the exact words and timestamp. I wrote it all out in careful detail like I was building a case file for someone, like documenting everything would somehow give me power over what was happening. Each entry got dated and timed and described as specifically as I could manage. It felt like something I could control when absolutely everything else in my life was spinning away from me. My phone rang during my break the next day and David's name showed up on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but he'd just keep calling until I did. I picked up and tried to sound normal, but he asked immediately what was wrong because he could hear the stress in my voice. I told him work had been really busy lately and I was just tired from not sleeping well. He said I'd been distant the last few days and wanted to know if something was bothering me. I said everything was fine, I just had a lot on my mind with work stuff. He offered to bring dinner over to my place that night so we could talk and relax together. I made up an excuse about needing to catch up on laundry and get some real sleep, promising we'd hang out this weekend instead. The lie tasted awful in my mouth, but telling him the truth would put him directly in the family's crosshairs. He said okay, but I could tell he was hurt and confused about why I was pulling away. After we hung up, I sat there hating myself for lying to him, but knowing it was the only way to keep him safe. The police station smelled like burnt coffee and floor cleaner when I walked in that evening. I approached the front desk and asked to speak with someone about threats and harassment. The officer behind the plexiglass told me to wait, and 20 minutes later, a woman in a gray blazer called my name. Detective Francine Keller had short brown hair and tired eyes that looked like they'd heard every story twice. She led me to a small interview room with a metal table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor. I sat down and started explaining about an ex-boyfriend who wouldn't leave me alone, the prepared lie sliding out easier than I expected. She took notes while I described the business card under my windshield and vague threats about knowing where I lived. Her expression stayed professional but skeptical, like she could smell the half-truths. She asked why I didn't report someone breaking into my apartment immediately. I stumbled through an explanation about not being totally sure it happened, that maybe I'd left the cabinet open myself. Her pen stopped moving and she looked at me for a long moment before writing something else down. She said she'd file a report and increase patrols near my address, but without concrete evidence or direct threats, there wasn't much else she could do. I thanked her and left with a case number written on a business card that felt useless in my pocket. The hardware store was bright and loud with country music playing over the speakers. I found the security section and stared at door bars and window alarms trying to figure out what would actually help. A portable door security bar cost $40 and a pack of window alarms was another $20. I checked my bank balance on my phone and saw the numbers that made my chest tight, but I bought them anyway. Back at my apartment, I wedged the security bar under the door handle and tested it 3 times to make sure it held. The window alarms took longer to install, little white sensors that would scream if the glass moved. I placed one on each window and tested them all, the shrill beeping making my neighbors probably hate me. The whole setup took an hour and gave me something to do with my hands besides shake. I knew the family had already proven they could get in whenever they wanted, but doing nothing felt worse than useless barriers. The next afternoon, I finished my shift and walked out to the parking lot scanning for anyone watching. My car looked normal until I got close and saw my rear tire completely shredded. The rubber hung in strips around the rim like someone had taken a knife to it systematically. I stood there staring at it while other employees walked past to their cars. It took 3 calls to find a shop that could come out and replace it, and another 2 hours of sitting in my car waiting for them to arrive. The replacement tire cost $87, which was most of my emergency cash. By the time I got to my evening shift, I was 40 minutes late, and Greg was waiting at the time clock with his arms crossed. He wrote me up right there in front of 2 other employees and said I was using up my second chances fast. I apologized and promised it wouldn't happen again, but his expression said he'd heard that before from people who didn't last. During a slow period the next day, I was straightening the cereal aisle when I noticed a manila envelope tucked between 2 boxes of cornflakes in my lane. It wasn't there 10 minutes ago when I'd restocked that section. I looked around, but the store was nearly empty except for an old man by the deli counter. I picked up the envelope and opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a printed photo of me and David sitting at the coffee shop last Saturday. We were laughing at something and his hand was on mine across the table. Someone had circled David's face in red marker, the circle thick and deliberate. There was no note, but I didn't need one. The message was clear as if they'd written it out. They could reach him anytime they wanted. I shoved the photo back in the envelope and stuffed it in my jacket pocket, my hands leaving sweat marks on the paper. I drove straight to David's apartment after work without calling first. He answered the door in his paramedic uniform between shifts and smiled when he saw me, but the smile faded fast. I told him we needed to talk and he let me in, his apartment smelling like the pizza he'd been eating. I stood by his couch instead of sitting and said I needed space, that things were moving too fast and I wasn't ready for this. He looked confused and asked what changed in the last week. I couldn't give him real answers, so I said something vague about work stress and personal stuff I was dealing with. He stepped closer and reached for my hand, but I pulled away. His face showed hurt that made my stomach turn, but staying away from him was the only way to keep him safe. David said he didn't accept that and he knew something was really wrong. He said I was scared of something and he wanted to help. I shook my head and told him he couldn't help with this, that I just needed him to give me space. He asked if this was about the guy who beat him up, and I said no, even though we both knew I was lying. His kindness made everything worse because I couldn't tell him the truth without painting a target on his back. I left his apartment with him calling after me, asking to please just talk to him. We weren't together anymore, but we weren't cleanly broken up either. Just stuck in some terrible limbo where he was hurt, and I was terrified. Back home, I dug through my emergency documents until I found the business card buried at the bottom of the box. Gabriel Blanchard, Assistant United States Attorney, with an office number in Chicago. He'd been the federal prosecutor who handled my testimony case 3 years ago. My hand hovered over my phone for 20 minutes while I tried to decide if calling him would make things better or worse. Finally, I dialed and got his voicemail. His voice professional and clipped. I left a message explaining I was the witness from the Torino case and I needed help, that the family had found me. I didn't expect him to remember me or even care after 3 years, but I left my number anyway and hung up feeling stupid. Tuesday night, I went to book club like I did every week, sitting in someone's living room drinking wine and pretending to discuss the novel. Halfway through, I realized my regular attendance was broadcasting my schedule to anyone watching. Every social media check-in at this house on Tuesday nights was a roadmap. I excused myself to the bathroom and deleted my accounts one by one. 3 years of carefully built normalcy disappeared as I hit confirm on each deletion. When I came back, the other members noticed I was distracted and asked if everything was okay. I smiled and said work had been crazy lately, and I was just tired. The lies were getting easier, which probably meant something bad about who I was becoming. Gabriel called back the next morning while I was stocking shelves in the cereal aisle. I stepped outside into the parking lot to take it, my breath making clouds in the cold air. He remembered my case and asked why I didn't enter formal witness protection back then. I explained I thought disappearing on my own would be enough, that I didn't want to deal with all the federal restrictions and monitoring. He was blunt about the limited resources available for witnesses who declined protection initially. He said he'd make some calls, but I shouldn't expect the same level of support as official protected witnesses. I thanked him and we hung up. His honesty somehow worse than false hope would have been. The electronics store clerk barely looked at me when I bought the prepaid phone with cash. I memorized the number while sitting in my car, repeating it over and over until it stuck. My regular phone stayed active so the family would think I wasn't taking extra precautions. The burner went into my go bag hidden in the closet for emergencies only. Separating my communications felt like something from a spy movie, but it was the only way to have conversations they might not be listening to. I tested the burner by calling it from my regular phone and watching both devices light up. Then I turned the burner off and buried it under my spare clothes where nobody would find it unless they tore my apartment apart. The burner phone buzzed in my hand 20 minutes later, and I stared at the unknown number lighting up the screen. I answered without saying anything, and Tony's voice came through calm and friendly like we were old friends catching up. He said we should meet tomorrow at the Route 80 diner around noon to discuss payment options like civilized people, and he made it very clear I should come alone. His tone never changed from that casual friendliness, but my hands started shaking because that calm meant he was completely confident I had no way out. I hung up and sat on my bathroom floor with my back against the tub trying to breathe normally. They'd tracked the burner phone somehow even though I'd paid cash and never given anyone the number, which meant they'd been following me or monitoring my purchases or had access to the store cameras. I pulled out the card Detective Francine had given me and dialed her number on the burner, keeping my voice low even though I was alone. She answered on the third ring and I explained about Tony's call and the meeting tomorrow. She was quiet for a few seconds and then said she couldn't spare officers for full surveillance, but she could be in the parking lot as backup. We worked out a plan where I'd wear my regular phone in my jacket pocket recording audio, and she'd stay in an unmarked car watching the entrance. It wasn't much protection, but it was better than going completely alone. She made me promise not to get in any vehicles with them, and to leave immediately if things felt wrong. I agreed and we hung up, and I spent the rest of the night staring at my ceiling with all the lights on. The next morning, I drove to the diner 40 minutes early and parked where I could see the highway entrance. My regular phone sat in my jacket pocket already recording, and I'd tested it 3 times to make sure it was working. The diner was one of those old chrome places with red vinyl booths and a long counter, half empty on a Tuesday afternoon. I took a booth in the back corner with a clear view of the parking lot and front door. The waitress brought coffee and I wrapped both hands around the cup to stop them from shaking. Tony's black sedan pulled in exactly at noon, and he got out with a younger guy I'd never seen before, both of them in expensive suits that looked wrong in this highway diner. They walked in like they owned the place and slid into the booth across from me. Tony smiled and waved the waitress over and ordered apple pie like we were having a normal family meal. The younger guy just stared at me with flat eyes that made my skin crawl. Tony asked how I was doing and said I looked healthy, that Nebraska seemed to agree with me. I picked up my coffee cup and it rattled against the saucer, so I set it back down. He talked about the weather and the long drive from Chicago while cutting his pie into neat pieces. Then a different man in a baseball cap walked past our table and dropped a folded piece of paper next to my plate without slowing down. Tony's smile got wider and he gestured at the note. I unfolded it with numb fingers and read the words written in block letters. We know about the cop in the parking lot. My stomach twisted and I looked up at Tony, who was still eating his pie calmly. He said we'd talk more soon and stood up, dropping a 20 on the table. They walked out and I sat there frozen watching them drive away. I drove home taking random turns and checking my mirrors every few seconds, but nobody followed me. My apartment door was still locked, just like I'd left it. But the second I walked inside, I knew something was wrong. The kitchen cabinet I always kept closed stood open an inch. My toothbrush sat on the wrong side of the bathroom sink. Nothing was stolen or obviously disturbed, but someone had been here going through my things. I walked through each room cataloging the tiny wrongness of everything, and then I saw it on the kitchen counter. A single plastic zip tie sitting in the middle of the clean surface like a business card. I grabbed my go bag from the closet and threw in extra clothes and my laptop, my hands moving on autopilot while my brain screamed at me to get out. I couldn't stay here anymore knowing they could walk in whenever they wanted. I locked the door behind me and drove to David's apartment building, parking 2 blocks away and walking back checking over my shoulder. He answered on the third knock looking surprised, and I told him I had a pipe burst and needed somewhere to sleep tonight. His expression said he knew I was lying, but he stepped aside and let me in. We sat on his couch not talking, and then he showed me his bedroom and got spare blankets from the closet. We lay in his bed not touching while I stared at the ceiling counting his breaths. The intimacy of sleeping next to someone who didn't know the truth made me feel more alone than being by myself ever had. Greg caught me by the break room the next morning before my shift started. He said this was my final warning about the tardiness and mistakes, that he'd given me multiple chances and I was running out of rope. I apologized and promised I'd do better, and he nodded, but I could see in his face that he was done making excuses for me. My job hung by a thread, and losing it meant losing my apartment and the last bits of stability holding my life together. I worked my shift scanning items on autopilot and trying not to think about zip ties or men in baseball caps. My phone rang during my lunch break and Gabriel's name showed on the screen. I stepped outside into the parking lot and answered. He said he'd been looking into options and he might be able to help me through a financial crimes investigation if I could provide evidence of the family's current illegal activities. Extortion was hard to prove without clear recordings or paper trails, he explained, but if I could document their money laundering or other crimes, it opened more doors. The idea of gathering evidence while they were watching me felt impossible, but I said I'd try. We hung up and I went back inside to finish my shift. That evening, I drove to the electronics store across town and bought a small wireless camera with rush shipping using cash. The clerk barely looked at me when I paid. Back in my apartment, I set it up on the bookshelf aimed at the front door, hiding it behind a row of paperbacks. The camera connected to an app on my phone and I tested it 3 times watching the live feed of my empty living room. Setting it up gave me a tiny sense of control, like I was fighting back even in this small way. If they came back, I'd at least have proof of the break-ins. I ate dinner standing at my kitchen counter and then lay in bed fully dressed with my shoes on, jerking awake at every sound from the hallway. My phone buzzed around midnight with a text from David asking if I was okay, and I typed back that I was fine. The lie came easier each time I told it. 2 days later, David showed up at my apartment after his paramedic shift looking shaken. He walked in without waiting for me to invite him, and stood in my living room with his arms crossed. He said a patient had muttered a name while he was checking vitals during a call. The name was Isabella Torino. David stared at me and asked who Isabella was, and why a random patient would say that name while looking at him. I could see the hurt and confusion in his face as he waited for an answer, all my carefully built lies crumbling around us. My mouth opened, but nothing came out, and the silence stretched between us like broken glass. I sat down on the couch because my legs felt too weak to keep standing, and told him my real name was Isabella Torino. The words came out in a rush as I explained about the testimony 3 years ago, about Uncle Sal and the construction bid rigging scheme, about how the family lost millions because I talked to the feds. David stood there frozen while I told him about Tony showing up in my apartment, about the $2 million demand, about how they knew everything about his schedule and where he worked. His face went through so many expressions that I couldn't track them all. Confusion giving way to shock, and then something that looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. He asked why I didn't tell him before, and I said because telling him made him a target, which apparently he already was now anyway. The silence after I finished talking felt worse than his questions had. He rubbed his face with both hands and said he needed time to think about this, that 6 months of lies was a lot to process. I wanted to grab his arm and beg him to stay, but I knew that would just make it worse. He walked to the door and paused with his hand on the knob, looking back at me like he was trying to figure out if he even knew who I was. Then he left and I listened to his footsteps fade down the hallway. I sat on that couch for maybe 20 minutes just staring at nothing before my brain started working again. Staying in my apartment felt impossible now that everything was falling apart, so I grabbed my go bag and the emergency cash and headed out to my car. I drove for 30 minutes checking my mirrors constantly, taking random turns and doubling back to make sure nobody was following me. The motel I found was on the far edge of town, the kind of place with peeling paint and a neon vacancy sign that buzzed. I paid cash to the clerk and gave a fake name, and he barely looked at me before handing over a key attached to a plastic diamond. The room smelled like old cigarette smoke mixed with the chemical smell of bleach, and the carpet had stains I didn't want to think about. I wedged the chair under the door handle and checked the window locks twice before sitting on the bed. Every sound from the hallway made me jump. Footsteps passing by, or doors slamming, or the ice machine rattling. I couldn't sleep even though I was exhausted, my mind running through worst-case scenarios on a loop. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up and just sat there watching the parking lot through a gap in the curtains. The next afternoon, I drove back to my apartment when I knew most people would be at work, parking 2 blocks away and approaching on foot. Everything looked normal from outside, but I stayed alert as I climbed the stairs and unlocked my door. Nothing seemed disturbed at first glance, but I went straight to my laptop and pulled up the camera feed from the hidden bookshelf camera. The footage showed my empty living room for hours. Then around midnight, a figure appeared in the frame. My hands shook as I watched someone move through my apartment using a key, not breaking in, but just walking in like they owned the place. The person was wearing dark clothes and kept their face turned away from the camera, too smart to get identified. They walked through my rooms, touching nothing but clearly looking around, then left one cabinet door open in the kitchen before leaving the same way they came in. The timestamp proved I wasn't crazy, that the break-ins were real, but the footage was too grainy to identify who it was. I downloaded everything to a USB drive and added it to my evidence collection with the business card and screenshots of the threatening texts. Having proof felt like the only solid thing in my life right now. My burner phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and my stomach dropped before I even read it. Tony's message said the family was losing patience, and I had until the end of the week to make a good faith payment. He wrote that it would be a shame if something happened to one of David's patients during a paramedic call, that accidents happen all the time in emergency medicine. The specific threat against David made something shift inside me from fear to anger. They could come after me all they wanted, but dragging David into this when he'd done nothing wrong crossed a line. I called Gabriel on the burner phone and told him I was ready to cooperate fully with whatever investigation he needed. He sounded surprised but pleased, saying he'd been hoping I'd come around. We set up a meeting at the federal building for the next morning where I could sign an affidavit about the threats and extortion attempts. The federal building was downtown in a bland concrete structure that looked like every government office I'd ever seen. Gabriel met me in the lobby and walked me through security, then up to a small conference room with a table and uncomfortable chairs. He explained that creating an official record of the threats was important for building a case, even if we couldn't arrest Tony right away. His assistant came in with a camera and photographed all my evidence while Gabriel typed up my statement on a laptop. I described every interaction with Tony, every threatening text, the break-ins captured on camera. Signing the affidavit felt like I was finally taking real action instead of just running and hiding. Gabriel made copies of everything and filed them in a case folder with my name on it. Detective Francine showed up about an hour into the meeting, and she and Gabriel spent 20 minutes coordinating their approach. Francine was honest about the limitations, saying local police resources were stretched too thin to provide protection detail. She promised to increase patrols near my apartment and the grocery store, but that was about all she could offer. Gabriel explained that building a federal case took time and evidence, more time than I probably had before the family decided to stop waiting. They both looked frustrated by the constraints they were working under. We talked through options for getting Tony on record making explicit threats, and Gabriel suggested setting up a controlled call where I could get him to clearly state the extortion demand. The idea made my stomach hurt, but I agreed because what else could I do? We spent the next 2 hours practicing the script, Gabriel coaching me on what phrases might count as prosecutable extortion under federal law. I had to get Tony to explicitly demand money and explicitly threaten violence, not just hint around the edges. The legal technicalities felt absurd when I was just trying to survive, but I wrote down all the key phrases Gabriel wanted me to work into the conversation. The monitored call happened the next day from a secure line at the federal building with Gabriel and Detective Francine listening on headphones. My hands were sweating, so bad I could barely hold the phone as I dialed Tony's number. He answered on the second ring, sounding relaxed and friendly. I tried to follow the script, asking directly about the payment terms and what would happen if I couldn't pay. Tony talked in circles about family obligations and helping with family debts, about how unfortunate situations could be prevented with cooperation. Every time I pushed for specifics, he deflected into vague references and coded language. He mentioned that people I cared about might face difficulties but never directly threatened violence. When I asked what kind of difficulties, he just laughed and said I was smart enough to figure it out. The call lasted 15 minutes, and by the end I was exhausted from trying to get him to say something prosecutable. Gabriel's expression when I hung up told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. The recording wasn't enough for charges. Tony had been too careful with his words. Detective Francine looked equally disappointed, saying they'd keep working the case, but this wasn't the breakthrough they needed. I wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all, that Tony could threaten me and everyone I knew, but as long as he used the right words, he was untouchable. My phone rang during the drive home and I saw it was Greg from the grocery store. He didn't waste time with pleasantries, just told me I'd missed 2 shifts without calling and he was letting me go. I tried to explain that I'd had emergencies, but he cut me off, saying I'd used up all my chances and he needed reliable employees. Losing my job felt like another piece of my life crumbling away. Without income, I couldn't afford my apartment much longer, couldn't buy food or gas or anything else. The family was winning by just applying steady pressure until everything collapsed around me. Gabriel connected me with a victim advocate named Yasmin Cornell, who specialized in helping people dealing with threats and stalking. She met me at a coffee shop the next day, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a professional manner. We spent 3 hours creating a detailed safety plan with escape routes from my apartment and workplace, emergency contacts, and protocols for different threat levels. She treated my fear as completely valid instead of paranoid, which made me want to cry from relief. Yasmin helped me file for a protection order against Tony, even though we both knew serving it would be nearly impossible since he was avoiding known addresses. The paperwork felt like doing something concrete, even if it was mostly symbolic. She gave me her card and made me promise to check in twice a week, saying isolation was dangerous when someone was targeting you. Having Yasmin take my situation seriously and actually help me plan for survival made me feel less alone than I had in weeks. The courthouse hearing happened 3 days later, and the judge granted the temporary protection order after reviewing Yasmin's documentation and my sworn statement about Tony's threats. I sat in the courtroom watching the judge sign the papers and felt a small surge of hope that maybe the legal system could actually protect me. Detective Francine filed the order immediately, and the sheriff's office started attempting to serve Tony at every known address connected to the family. They tried the Chicago office of Torino Construction, where a secretary said Tony hadn't been in for weeks. They tried his listed home address where his ex-wife answered the door and said she hadn't seen him in months. They tried 3 different properties connected to family businesses and came up empty every time. Detective Francine called me after the 5th failed attempt, and I could hear the frustration in her voice when she explained that Tony was deliberately avoiding service. The protection order existed on paper, but it was basically worthless if we couldn't officially notify Tony that he was violating it by coming near me. I thanked her for trying and hung up feeling like I'd just wasted everyone's time with legal procedures that the family knew how to dodge. My phone rang an hour later and David's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for 3 rings before answering, my stomach tight with worry about what I'd say to him. His voice was quiet when he said he'd been thinking about everything I told him, about the lies and the danger and why I'd kept it all hidden. He said he was hurt that I hadn't trusted him with the truth, but he understood why I'd done it. I could hear something in his voice that sounded like fear mixed with determination, and he asked what he could do to help me through this. My throat closed up because what I needed to say was the opposite of what I wanted. I told him the best way to help was to stay away from me until this was over, that being close to me put him in danger. He started to argue, but I cut him off and said I couldn't live with myself if the family hurt him because of me. The silence on the line lasted so long I thought he'd hung up, but then he said okay, in a voice that broke my heart. I ended the call and sat there staring at my phone, knowing I'd just pushed away the one person who'd made me feel normal in 3 years. That night I was heating up soup in my apartment when my phone rang again and David's name appeared. I answered expecting him to try talking me out of the breakup, but instead I heard breathing that sounded wrong, wet and painful. He tried to say my name, but it came out slurred, and I realized something was terribly wrong. I asked what happened, and he managed to get out that he'd been jumped after his shift by 2 guys in masks. They'd beaten him in the hospital parking lot, breaking his nose and splitting his lip and leaving him conscious enough to understand it was a message. I grabbed my keys and drove to the emergency room where I found him in a treatment bay, with his face swollen almost beyond recognition. His jaw was so messed up I could barely understand him when he tried to talk, and the doctor said he needed x-rays to check for fractures. I held his hand while they wheeled him away for imaging, and felt rage burning in my chest hotter than the fear. The family's message was absolutely clear. They could reach anyone I cared about whenever they wanted, and my attempts to protect David by pushing him away had meant nothing. The next morning I checked my mailbox and found a bank slip mixed in with junk mail and bills. It showed a wire transfer from Torino Construction to a local vendor for $30,000, dated 2 weeks ago. The transaction looked legitimate on its surface, but I recognized it as exactly the kind of money laundering the family had been doing for decades. I photographed the slip from multiple angles and drove straight to Gabriel's office. He studied the document carefully and said this was exactly the kind of evidence that could build a financial crimes case, that following the money often worked when direct threats were too vague to prosecute. For the first time since Tony had appeared in my apartment, I felt like I might have something the feds actually wanted, something more valuable than just my testimony about extortion. I spent the next 2 days at the public library going through business records and property transactions, connecting Torino Construction to various shell companies and suspicious transfers. The research gave me something to focus on besides David's swollen face and my own fear, and I found myself getting absorbed in following the paper trail. Gabriel met me at a coffee shop to review my findings and said I was building a solid foundation for investigation, that this kind of detailed documentation could open doors for warrants and subpoenas. The work gave me purpose beyond just surviving. I was actively fighting back against the family instead of just hiding and hoping. Gabriel called me 3 days later with news that a low-level family associate had been pulled over for a traffic stop, and the officer found an illegal firearm in his vehicle. The guy was facing serious charges, and Gabriel said this created an opportunity to flip him if they could offer the right deal. Every small crack in the family's operation felt like progress, even though Tony was still out there and still dangerous. I sat in Gabriel's office and proposed something that scared me but felt necessary. A meeting with Tony where I'd bring a down payment to show good faith. Gabriel leaned back in his chair and considered it, then said they could use the meeting as an opportunity to catch Tony making explicit threats on record. We spent 2 hours planning a careful operation with minimal police presence to avoid spooking Tony. The decoy cache would be fitted with a GPS tracker, and I'd wear my phone recording audio in my pocket. Detective Francine joined us to coordinate the surveillance team, but then Gabriel got a call from the courthouse. The judge had denied authorization for a full wire operation, saying the evidence so far didn't meet the threshold for that level of surveillance. We sat there looking at each other and I could see the frustration on both their faces. Detective Francine said they'd proceed with just my phone recording and distant backup, keeping officers far enough away that Tony wouldn't spot them. I signed liability waivers acknowledging the risks and promising I understood this wasn't official protection. The plan felt flimsy and dangerous, but it was the only option we had. I arrived at the empty construction yard at dusk, carrying a canvas bag with $10,000 in marked bills and the GPS tracker buried underneath. My heart was pounding so hard I felt dizzy, but I forced myself to walk calmly across the gravel lot toward the trailer where Tony had told me to meet. Every shadow looked like it could be hiding someone, and every sound made me flinch. The construction equipment loomed around me in the fading light, creating dark spaces where anything could be waiting. I reached the trailer and stood there clutching the bag, my phone recording in my jacket pocket and Detective Francine supposedly watching from a van 3 blocks away. Tony appeared from behind a cement mixer with his enforcer beside him, both of them relaxed and confident as they approached. Tony was wearing another expensive suit that looked out of place in the dirt and gravel, and he smiled at me like we were meeting for coffee instead of an extortion payment. He made small talk about how smart I was to cooperate, how the family always appreciated reasonable people who understood how things worked. I tried to steer the conversation toward explicit threats like Gabriel had coached me, asking what would happen if I couldn't make the full payment. My voice came out steadier than I expected, and I kept my hands from shaking as I held the bag. Tony smiled and leaned back against the cement mixer, his hands in his pockets like we were just chatting. He said something about how the family understood cash flow problems, how they were reasonable people who could work with me if I showed good faith. His words stayed vague, talking about how it would be unfortunate if David had an accident on one of his calls, how paramedics dealt with dangerous situations every day. The enforcer shifted beside him, his jaw tight, and I could see him getting restless with Tony's careful word games. I tried to push harder, asking what would happen if I couldn't pay at all, and Tony just shrugged and said, people who couldn't meet their obligations sometimes had unfortunate things happen to their loved ones. The enforcer unzipped the canvas bag to check the money, and his hand stopped halfway inside. He pulled out a bill and held it up to the fading light, then dug deeper and found the GPS tracker wedged between the stacks. His face went dark, and he looked at Tony, then back at me, and I saw the exact moment everything shifted. Tony's expression changed from patient to cold in a second. He said one word, just my name, Isabella, but the way he said it made my stomach drop. The enforcer dropped the bag and started toward me, and Tony was right behind him. I stumbled backward trying to get distance, and Tony shoved me hard in the chest with both hands. My feet caught on loose gravel, and I went down into the metal scaffolding, the impact driving the air from my lungs. My phone flew out of my pocket and skittered across the ground, the screen cracking against the concrete. The enforcer grabbed the bag with the money and tracker, and they started moving toward a black car parked behind the equipment. I fumbled for my watch and pressed the panic button hard, feeling it click 3 times under my finger. Tony turned back and saw what I was doing, and his face twisted with anger. I scrambled on my hands and knees toward a bulldozer, my knee screaming where I'd scraped it raw on the scaffolding. Blood soaked through my jeans as I crawled behind the massive tire, pressing myself against the treads and trying to make myself small. I could hear their footsteps on the gravel, circling around trying to find me in the growing darkness. My knee throbbed and my ribs ached where I'd hit the scaffolding, and I focused on breathing quietly through my nose. Then I heard sirens in the distance, getting closer fast, and Tony cursed. The footsteps moved away quickly, and I heard car doors slam. An engine roared to life and tires squealed on gravel. I stayed hidden behind the bulldozer, my whole body shaking, listening to the sirens get louder. Multiple police cars converged on the construction yard with lights flashing red and blue across the equipment. I heard doors opening and voices shouting, and then Detective Francine calling my name. I tried to answer, but my voice came out as a croak. She called again, and I managed to yell that I was by the bulldozer. Footsteps ran toward me, and suddenly she was there, helping me stand up. My knee buckled, and she caught me, her face tight with concern as she looked at the blood on my jeans and the scrapes on my hands. She radioed that she had me, and I was injured but stable. Other officers were spreading out across the yard searching for Tony and the enforcer, but the black car was already gone. Detective Francine walked me to her cruiser and sat me in the back seat, calling for an ambulance. I told her they went east toward the highway, and she relayed it to the other units. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as a paramedic cleaned the scrape on my knee and checked my ribs. 20 minutes later, the radio crackled with an update. Officers had stopped the enforcer 3 blocks away during a routine traffic check. They found the marked money in his trunk along with an illegal handgun. Tony had escaped on foot and was still at large. The paramedic wrapped my knee and said I should go to the hospital for x-rays, but I refused. Detective Francine drove me to the police station where Gabriel was already waiting. Over the next 8 hours, I sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs while they interrogated the enforcer in a room down the hall. Gabriel came out periodically to update me. The enforcer was facing serious charges for the weapon and assault. They were offering him a deal if he'd testify against Tony and provide details about the family's operations. Around 3 in the morning, Gabriel sat down next to me and said the enforcer had given them some information about the extortion scheme, but refused to testify against Tony directly. It was partial progress, but not enough to bring charges yet. Tony was now officially a fugitive, and the family knew I was cooperating with law enforcement. The next afternoon, Gabriel called me to his office and explained that the family would likely back off temporarily due to all the police attention. But Tony was still out there and still dangerous, and I was now a known cooperator, which made me an even bigger target. He said I should accept provisional witness relocation assistance. It meant leaving Nebraska and starting completely over again in a new city. I sat there staring at him and felt something break inside me. 3 years I'd spent building a life here, making friends, dating David, pretending to be normal. The idea of running again made me want to scream. But Gabriel's face was serious, and I knew he was right. I spent the next 2 days packing my apartment into 2 suitcases, throwing away everything that wouldn't fit. My landlord kept my security deposit when I broke the lease early. I sent David a text saying I had to leave town and I was sorry for everything. His response came an hour later. Just 2 words. Be safe. The brevity hurt worse than if he'd been angry. I wanted him to yell at me or demand explanations, but instead he just let me go. Gabriel arranged temporary housing in a city 4 states away under provisional protection protocols. I'd get a new identity and some financial help while the investigation continued. It wasn't full witness protection, but it was more support than I'd had 3 years ago when I ran the first time. Detective Francine drove me to the bus station early on a Thursday morning. She walked me all the way to the platform and handed me her card, making me promise to check in with her every week. She said she'd keep working the case from Nebraska and let me know if there were any developments with Tony. Her voice was gentle and her eyes were kind, and suddenly I was crying for the first time through this whole nightmare. She hugged me and told me I was brave and I'd get through this. The bus ride took 14 hours through flat highways and small towns. I barely slept, just watched the lights blur past my window and thought about everything I was leaving behind again. The other passengers ignored me, and I was grateful to be invisible. This was the 3rd time I'd run from my family. First when I testified, then when I created the Stella identity in Nebraska, and now this. I didn't know if I had the strength to build another life from nothing. When I finally arrived in my new city, a USA Marshal liaison met me at the station. He drove me to a small furnished apartment in a quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets. The place was generic and impersonal with beige walls and basic furniture, but it was clean and safe. He handed me a new ID with the name Stella Morrison and a packet of information about my new identity. He warned me not to contact anyone from Nebraska, not even Detective Francine except through official channels. He said someone would check on me in a week and left me alone in the empty apartment. I sat on the couch and looked at my new driver's license with my photo and a stranger's name, and wondered how many times I could reinvent myself before there was nothing left of the real me. The first week I kept the curtains drawn and only went out when I needed food or basic supplies from the corner store 2 blocks away. I walked different routes each time, memorizing street names and checking for anyone following me, my hand always near the pepper spray in my pocket. The neighborhood was quiet with older houses and mature trees, people walking dogs in the morning, and kids playing basketball in driveways after school. Everything looked normal and safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, that the family had people here already waiting for me to settle in. On day 4, I found a coffee shop 3 blocks from my apartment with a help wanted sign in the window, and the owner hired me on the spot when I said I could start immediately, and didn't mind working for cash while my paperwork went through. The job was simple, making drinks and wiping tables, nothing like the grocery store, but it gave me something to do besides sit in my apartment counting minutes. My new ID said Stella Morrison, and every time someone used that name, I had to remind myself to respond, to act like I'd been Stella my whole life instead of just a few days. The apartment felt temporary and unreal, like I was house-sitting for someone else, and I kept catching myself planning to go back to Nebraska before remembering there was nothing to go back to. I bought a small notebook and started writing down details about my new identity so I wouldn't slip up, practicing my signature and memorizing the fake birthday and hometown Gabriel's people had created for me. At night, I lay in bed listening to unfamiliar sounds from neighboring apartments, voices through walls and footsteps overhead, wondering if any of them were watching me for the family. The USA Marshal liaison stopped by on day 6 to check on me and bring my permanent identification documents, telling me to call if anything seemed off or if I needed help. He gave me a card with a number to reach him anytime and said someone would check in weekly for the first month, which should have made me feel safer, but just reminded me how much danger I was still in. 3 days into my coffee shop job, Detective Francine called my new phone and I stepped into the storage room to take it. She said the local case against the enforcer was moving forward, and he was looking at serious time for the weapons charge and assault, maybe enough to convince him to cooperate more fully with the federal investigation. Then she mentioned that Greg from the grocery store had asked if she knew where I went, said he was worried because I'd seemed really stressed my last few days there. The fact that someone noticed I was gone, that someone cared enough to ask about me, hit me harder than I expected, and I had to swallow past the lump in my throat. I thanked Detective Francine for the update and promised to stay off the grid like the marshal told me, and she said she'd keep working the case from Nebraska and let me know if anything changed with Tony. When we hung up, I stood in the storage room surrounded by boxes of coffee beans and paper cups, trying not to cry over a manager who probably just needed someone to cover shifts. The following week, Gabriel called with better news. His voice cautious but optimistic as he explained that a sealed indictment had been filed against a lower-level family associate for money laundering, based on the financial records I'd helped them trace. He said Tony was still at large and officially a fugitive now, but the family's operations were under increased scrutiny from multiple agencies, and they were having trouble conducting business as usual. It was meaningful progress, real consequences for people who'd thought they were untouchable, but it didn't resolve my situation because Tony was still out there, and the family still wanted their $2 million. Gabriel reminded me to stay vigilant and report anything suspicious, and I promised I would, even though part of me wondered if I'd ever stop being vigilant, if this was just my life now forever. Around the same time, Yasmin called to check on how I was settling in, and mentioned a support group for people in witness protection and protective relocation that met Tuesday evenings at a church near my apartment. I almost said no because going to a group meant admitting I needed help, meant sitting with strangers and talking about being scared, but something in her voice made me agree to try it once. The church basement was exactly what I expected, folding chairs in a circle, and a coffee pot on a table by the door, half a dozen people of different ages who all had that same look in their eyes that I recognized from my own mirror. We didn't use our real names and we didn't ask questions about each other's situations, just talked about the constant vigilance and the loneliness of starting over, and the guilt of leaving people behind. A woman about my age described checking her car for tracking devices every morning, and I nodded because I did the same thing. And an older man talked about how he still flinched at loud noises 5 years after relocating. They shared coping strategies they'd learned, ways to manage the anxiety and fear without letting it consume you, and for the first time since leaving Nebraska, I felt like maybe I wasn't crazy for being this paranoid. After the meeting, a few people exchanged phone numbers for check-ins between sessions, and I added 3 contacts to my phone under fake names, grateful to have people who understood without needing explanations. I was starting to think maybe I could actually do this, build something stable here, when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that just said, "See you soon," and my blood went cold. My hands shook as I called the Marshal liaison and reported it, reading him the exact message and the timestamp, and he told me to stay inside while he ran the number and updated my security protocols. The number was a burner that had already been disconnected, untraceable just like I knew it would be, and the Marshal said he was tightening my check-ins to every other day and flagging my file as high priority. The message proved the family hadn't given up, that they'd somehow tracked me to this new city, even with all the precautions we'd taken, and the fear I'd thought was finally settling down came roaring back worse than before. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound and checking the door locks over and over, my packed go bag sitting by the bed ready for another run. 2 weeks later, Gabriel asked me to provide video testimony for the grand jury investigating the family's financial crimes, explaining that my statement about their operations and the extortion attempts would help build their case. I agreed immediately because speaking about it officially felt like taking back some of the power they'd tried to steal from me, turning my fear into evidence that could actually hurt them. We spent 2 days preparing my statement in a secure federal building, Gabriel coaching me on what details mattered most and how to present the timeline clearly. I described the construction business fronts and the money laundering patterns I'd observed growing up in the family, then walked through every interaction with Tony from the customer's message at the grocery store to the confrontation in the construction yard. The video recording felt strange and formal, me sitting in a chair talking to a camera about my cousin threatening to kill people I cared about. But by the end, I felt stronger somehow, like I'd turned my testimony into a weapon they couldn't take away. Around the same time, a message came through Gabriel's secure channel from David saying he was healing from the attack and hoped I was safe, but he didn't ask where I was or suggest trying to reunite. I read it sitting at my kitchen table and felt my chest tighten with all the things I wanted to say but couldn't, all the apologies and explanations that wouldn't change anything. I wrote and deleted a dozen responses, trying to find words that weren't too much or too little, before finally settling on, just, "Thank you, I hope you heal completely," because some relationships don't survive this kind of trauma, and that has to be okay. I saved his message even though I knew I shouldn't, a tiny piece of my Nebraska life that I couldn't quite let go of yet. That week, I made the decision to keep the name Stella Morrison permanently, signing the papers that made it official and legal instead of just a temporary cover. I went through the few belongings I'd brought from Nebraska and found one small photo of my grandmother from my Isabella life, the only family picture I'd kept, and tucked it in my wallet behind my new driver's license. The act of integrating pieces of my past identity with my present Felt like progress instead of betrayal, like I was finally accepting that I could be both people at once. I wasn't erasing who I was, just adding layers of protection around the parts of myself that mattered most, building something new that the family couldn't destroy. 3 months after arriving, I started running in my new neighborhood early each morning before my coffee shop shift, my eyes always scanning parked cars and faces on the street, but my stride getting steadier with each passing week. I had a job I didn't hate where my coworkers knew me as the quiet girl who made good lattes, a therapist who understood my situation without needing all the details, and a growing sense that I could actually survive this. Tony was still out there somewhere, and the family hadn't forgotten about their $2 million, but I was building something real again with people who actually wanted to help me stay safe. I attended the support group every Tuesday and checked in with the Marshal liaison twice a week, maintaining my routines while staying alert for threats. My apartment started feeling less temporary as I added small touches like plants on the windowsill and photos on the fridge, claiming the space as mine instead of just a place I was hiding. Some mornings I woke up and forgot to be scared for a few seconds before reality came crashing back, but those seconds were getting longer, and I was learning to live in them. I didn't know if Tony would ever stop looking for me, or if the family would eventually decide I wasn't worth the trouble, but I was done running blind and alone. This time I had Detective Francine checking in from Nebraska, Gabriel building a case that might actually put them away, Yasmin helping me navigate the system, and a whole group of people who understood what it meant to start over. I was Stella Morrison now, officially and permanently, and maybe that was enough. I'm so relieved she made it through to the other side and found some peace again. Sometimes standing up for yourself comes with consequences you didn't expect, but she handled it with incredible strength. If this story resonated with you, I'd love for you to subscribe and be part of our community. Thank you for being here, friends. Take care, and I'll see you next time.